These are two people who lived 12,000 years ago, buried together, arms interlocked, facing each other in the dirt for eternity. The question this raises is simple, and it is not as easy to answer as you might think. Did they love each other, or were they just two bodies that happened to be useful to one another? For most of the 20th century, the scientific answer was blunt. Early humans mated. They did not love. Love, in this view, was a cultural invention, a story humans told themselves once they had the leisure time to write poetry and paint portraits. Our ancestors, according to this model, were driven by something called reproduction, resource sharing, survival math. Attachment was a myth we projected backward onto animals, too busy staying alive to feel anything as complicated as devotion. That view has been quietly collapsing for the last 30 years. And it hasn't collapsed because of philosophy or wishful thinking. It's collapsed because of neurochemistry, primatology, and the fossil record. Three separate fields that almost by accident arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Pair bonding, the biological foundation of what we call love, is not new. It's not even particularly human. It's old. And once you understand what it's actually made of, the question stops being, did ancient humans love? And becomes something stranger. How far back does love actually go? Let's start with the chemistry, because that's where the real evidence lies. In the early 1990s, researchers studying a small rodent called the prairie vole noticed something odd. Prairie voles do something almost no mammals do. They mate for life. A male and female pair up, build a nest together, raise pups together, and if one partner dies, the survivor often refuses to pair again. Compare that to the prairie vole's close cousin, the montane vole, which is nearly identical genetically, but behaves nothing like this. It mates and moves on, no bond, no nest, sharing no loyalty, same genus, same size, same diet, completely different social lives. So researchers went looking for the difference, and they found it in the brain, specifically in two hormones oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin is often called the bonding hormone, and that nickname undersells what it actually does. It floods the brain during childbirth, breastfeeding, orgasm, and, critically, during prolonged physical closeness with a specific individual. It doesn't just create a pleasant feeling. It rewires the brain's reward circuitry so that one particular partner starts to feel irreplaceable. The prairie vole's brain is dense with oxytocin and vasopressin receptors in exactly the regions tied to reward and memory. The montane vole's brain has almost none in those same regions. Same chemical, different wiring. That's the entire difference between a species that bonds for life and one that doesn't. Here's why this matters for the question of ancient humans primates, including us, run on the same chemical system. Human brains are dense with oxytocin and vasopressin receptors in the same reward regions that light up in bonded voles. When two humans hold each other, make eye contact, or have sex, oxytocin spikes in both partners. It's the same molecule doing the same job it does in a 12-gram rodent. Evolution didn't invent a new chemical for human love. It repurposed one that's been used to build monogamous bonds in mammals for tens of millions of years. This is the first crack in the ancient humans just mated theory. The biological hardware for attachment isn't a recent software update. It's baked into mammalian brains at a level far older than modern humans, far older than the genus Homo, far older than primates themselves. So if the hardware is ancient, the next question is whether early hominins were actually running it, or whether humans are simply an exception, a species that developed pair, bonding late, for reasons unrelated to anything resembling love. This is where anthropologists start looking at bodies instead of brains. One of the strangest and most persuasive arguments comes from something almost embarrassingly physical: human testicle size. Across the animal kingdom, there's a well-documented relationship between mating systems and testes to body mass ratio. Species where males compete for many mates and females mate with multiple males in a short window. Chimpanzees are the classic example, tend to have large tests relative to body size because sperm competition rewards quantity. Species that are strictly pair, bonded like gibbons, have small tests relative to body size because there's no competition to outproduce. Humans sit almost exactly in the middle. Not as extreme as chimpanzees, not as minimal as gibbons. That middle position is now widely interpreted by evolutionary biologists as evidence of mild polygyny with a strong pair bonding tendency. In plain language, a species built mostly for long-term partnerships with some flexibility around the edges. It's not proof of monogamy, but it's strong evidence against the idea that early humans were purely promiscuous, opportunistic maters with no drive toward exclusive attachment. Then there's a second physical clue, one that shows up not in soft tissue, but in bone: the human infant. Human babies are born catastrophically helpless compared to almost every other mammal. A newborn wildebeest can stand and run within minutes. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur unassisted almost immediately. A human infant can do neither. It cannot hold its own head up. It cannot regulate its own body temperature efficiently. It will not be able to feed itself, walk, or survive alone for years. An enormous stretch of vulnerability by mammalian standards. This helplessness is a direct consequence of something called the obstetric dilemma. Human ancestors evolved narrower hips for efficient, upright walking at roughly the same time their brains were getting dramatically larger. The compromise was to give birth earlier, before the skull got too big to pass through the birth canal, and finish the brain's development outside the womb. It's an extraordinary evolutionary trade-off, and it comes with a brutal cost. A human mother alone cannot easily keep a helpless infant fed, warm, defended, and alive for the years it takes to become self-sufficient, not while also gathering food and avoiding predators. That mathematical problem is one of the leading explanations anthropologists give for why pair bonding and broader cooperative caregiving became so deeply embedded in human biology. A partner who stays, who provisions food, who defends the nest, who shares the impossible burden of an infant that takes a decade to become independent, isn't a luxury. In the ecology of early hominins, that partner is very often the difference between an infant that survives and one that doesn't. Natural selection does not need altruism to produce loyalty. It needs consequences. And the consequence of abandonment, for a species with infants this helpless, was often a dead infant and a dead lineage. This is a crucial point because it reframes the whole debate. The old model treated love and mating as opposites, as if a behavior driven by reproductive strategy couldn't also be emotionally real. But that's not how brains work. Evolution doesn't need to choose between this behavior is useful and this behavior feels meaningful. It builds feelings precisely because they're useful. Hunger isn't a lie your body tells you to make you eat. It's the mechanism that makes you eat. Attachment isn't a lie your body tells you to keep a partner around. It's the mechanism that keeps a partner around. The chemistry doesn't cheapen the experience. It's the delivery system for the experience. So, what does the fossil and archaeological record actually show? Once you start looking for it with this framework in mind, burial practices are one of the clearest signals because burial is expensive. Digging a grave, especially with Stone Age tools, takes time and energy that could otherwise go towards survival. Doing it anyway, for someone who is, in purely reproductive terms, no longer useful, is a behavior that's very hard to explain without some form of emotional significance attached to the relationship. Double burials, where two individuals are interred together, deliberately positioned in close physical contact, appear at multiple sites across the archaeological record, spanning tens of thousands of years and multiple hominin populations. Some of the most striking examples show adults arranged facing one another, limbs interlaced, sometimes with matching grave goods placed with both bodies, as if whoever buried them wanted the pairing itself, not just the individuals, to be preserved. Archaeologists are cautious about reading too much into any single burial. Sometimes double burials reflect simultaneous deaths from disease or disaster rather than romantic partnership, and it's genuinely difficult to distinguish a pair, bonded couple from a parent-child pair or two individuals joined for entirely different reasons. But taken as a pattern, across dozens of sites and thousands of years, these burials tell a consistent story. Early humans were capable of forming specific, individualized attachment strong enough to shape how they treated the dead. That's not a behavior you'd expect from a species running on cold reproductive calculation alone. There's a second, quieter kind of evidence that tends to get less attention than dramatic burials care for the sick and disabled. Skeletal remains have been found showing individuals who survived for years with injuries or conditions that would have made them unable to fend for themselves. A healed but severely debilitating leg fracture, for instance, in a population with no evidence of stable, defensible camps. Someone fed that person. Someone protected that person for years, with no immediate reproductive payoff, sometimes with no ongoing sexual relationship at all. This kind of finding pushes the story beyond mate, pairing, and into something broader, a demonstrated capacity for sustained, costly care directed at specific individuals over long periods of time without immediate benefit. That capacity is the same neurochemical machinery, oxytocin, vasopressin, the reward circuitry that makes one particular person's well-being feel like it matters, just extended beyond a mating pair into the wider bonds of family and group. None of this means ancient humans experienced romantic love exactly the way we narrate it today, with anniversaries, wedding rings, and love songs. Love, as a cultural performance, absolutely does have a history. The specific rituals, the specific language, the specific expectations we associate with romance today are relatively recent inventions, shaped by agriculture, property, religion, and economics. That part of the old theory was right. Ancient humans were not writing sonnets, but the underlying biological experience, the neurochemical state of being specifically, irreplaceably attached to another individual, of feeling that person's absence as a kind of pain and their presence as a kind of relief, that appears to be far older than any of our rituals. It predates language. It very likely predates our own species. It's written into the reward circuitry of the mammalian brain, tested and preserved by natural selection because, for a species raising catastrophically helpless offspring in a dangerous world, attachment wasn't a poetic luxury. It was a survival technology. So, back to the two skeletons in the ground, arms wrapped around each other for 12,000 years. Science can't tell you what those two people said to each other, or whether they had a word for what they felt. But it can tell you this: the chemistry that would have made one of them feel like the other was irreplaceable was already sitting in both of their brains, fully operational, doing exactly what it does in yours. Whoever buried them arranged their arms that way for a reason. Maybe it wasn't the version of love we'd recognize in a movie, but it was almost certainly not just mating. It was the same ancient circuitry, older than agriculture, older than cities, older than us, quietly insisting that this person, out of everyone, mattered most.